The rest of the world without China, actually the growth was roughly 35%, but China alone grew by over 150%. So it has become an enormous player on the global market.
The solar industry has seen yet another record-breaking year in 2023. The global market outlook, compiled by SolarPower Europe, actually states that 447 gigawatts have been installed, with solar clearly dominating the field within renewables. While we already dove into a market analysis for renewables in an earlier episode of this mini-series, it's time to have a closer look at solar in particular, given that it constitutes 80% of all of the growth of renewables. What are the main drivers for it to outpace any other means of power generation? Which regions and technologies are responsible for this boom? Which policies would be needed to turn this boom into a steady and even increasing development? And, last but not least, how could we spread investments more evenly in regards to a fair and social distribution of solar? Stay tuned and you'll find out in this episode. Welcome yet again to our yearly special mini-series of the Smarter E podcast, recorded live here in Munich during the Smarter E conference and exhibition 2024. We made sure to get some of the most interesting international experts and industry representatives and talk to them about the most exciting trends and developments while creating the renewable energy system of the future. Now, of course, we seized the opportunity being here at the Smarter E Europe to once again single out one of the best experts to talk to, and I'm really happy that I actually have the opportunity to speak to Christophe Lits, because he is a market analyst at SolarPower Europe, and not just any market analyst. He has been working intensively on the global market outlook of SolarPower Europe, so he's the best person to talk to. And those of you, and if there is anybody out there who hasn't heard about SolarPower Europe yet, it's the premier association for the European solar and PV sector, uniting more than 300 plus organizations. Welcome, Christophe.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Christophe, before we dive into numbers and details, you really worked on this, on the numbers. Now, being here at the Smarter Europe, you're actually in the market itself. You meet all these players, all the stakeholders that provide the numbers you've been working on. How does that feel to finally get into the field again?
It feels amazing. And actually for us, those are all the players that we are already discussing ahead of the event, because all of the companies, the association, the manufacturer which we engaged before doing the market outlook to actually talk to them and to actually have their input so that we can work on the report. But it's amazing to see like the energy that's here. The event is growing bigger and bigger every year, and that's along with the industry.
Now, usually in this podcast, we throw around a lot of big numbers. Just 2 days ago, while we record this year, it's the second day and the Smarter E exhibition. And on the first day, which actually was the conference, I talked to Rana Adib of REN21, and they have the Renewables Global Status Report. I think she mentioned that they estimated 473 gigawatts of solar being put out there in the market and being installed in 2023. It's not a big difference, but how is it that various organizations come up with slightly varying numbers for the same year?
So yeah, if you look at the different forecasts and numbers by different analysts, usually you will find there's a small difference between all numbers, and there are several reasons behind that. First of all is that at the moment, if you look at the data for that each country report the installation, those numbers are changing all the time, because PV is such a distributed technology that the time that it gets registered to the national organization, there is sometimes a little bit of difference. But we're not talking about a big difference here, maybe just 1 or 2% usually. Then there is another component to that, is the DC to AC ratio. So to make it not too complicated, basically a solar panel produced in AC and then needs to be converted to DC via the inverter. And then there is a difference in the ratio that a country uses. But in general, we're in the range of 1.25, depending on the country and depending on the segment. That's roughly where we're going. But then you can see a little bit of difference here.
All right, that makes perfect sense. So also depending on the exact sort of week in the year that you start compiling your numbers, you might have to work with different numbers depending on what's available by all the organizations reporting to you. Now, from those 447 gigawatts in your report, I think China has been a significant driver of growth because they contributed alone with 253 gigawatts of new capacity, which is more than 50%. So what are the main factors behind this explosive growth of the Chinese solar market?
Yes, and it's actually right that you're mentioning that specific role of China, because indeed, if we look at the rest of the world without China, actually the growth was roughly 35%, but China alone grew by over 150%. So it has become an enormous player on the global market, and that makes actually also a bit more difficult to forecast actually, because there is such a big player. But the main reason behind the growth of China, the growth of solar PV in China, I think there's several. First of all, as a bit for the rest of the world, they actually increased a lot the production capacity, not only to export, but also to actually support the internal market. And so that actually drove a lot of installation in the country. If you look a bit backwards, last year was a lot the residential and the rooftop market that was growing. This year we've observed a shift in that, and it was much more utility scale projects, so large scale project being connected, especially at the end of the year, because they had some deadline to meet for the grid connection. So we have seen, I think it was roughly 90 gigawatts of utility scale PV connected in the last couple of months. So that's a huge quantity, and that's maybe like the first factor that really went.
90 gigawatt. I mean, that's very roughly almost a fifth of the total amount of capacity being added. And that just in the past or in the last months of 2023. So, wow, that's quite impressive.
Yes, indeed. And actually, it's a trend we're seeing quite often in China, that the last quarter is usually the largest quarter in the market in general. And so if I continue on what are also the reasons that explain the growth of China. So we have to remember that China is a huge country and they have to decarbonize a lot. So they're still very reliant on coal power to generate electricity. And with the pressure of international climate organization, they actually need, and for their own good also, they need to decarbonize the sector. And so they still need to develop renewable, and solar being the fastest deployment technology. That's the easiest way to go. And if we look a bit backwards, so China was massive in terms of absolute installation, with over 1 panel out of 2 installed in 2023 being in China. But if we look at the watt per capita, so meaning like the amount of module installed per person in the country, China is not even in the top 5 market yet. So they're roughly at 600 watts per capita in China. If you look at a country such as the Netherlands, they have over 1,000. In Australia, that's 1,300. Germany, they're roughly almost at 1,000. So there's still some room to go.
Some room to go, but I guess to give it more context, that's watt per capita. But how does that relate to energy consumption per capita?
Yeah, that's also a difference, because we have probably a much higher consumption per capita in the EU and in Western countries in general. But still, when we're looking at the emission per capita, I think the emission per capita remains the largest one in China compared to Europe. Then there's also the whole discussion about consumption in Europe versus consumption in China, with the production being concentrated in China. So that's also, if you take like the global macroscope, there is work to do at every level. But looking at the power sector, China has still some room to go actually to increase.
No, that's interesting. Really, that's such a pleasure to have somebody like you here who allows you to really dive into the nitty-gritty details and shed some light at making sense of these numbers. Now, you said that having such a dominating player as China makes work for you as an analyst difficult, because it makes it really hard to forecast. But what does it mean in terms of the consequences for the market itself, having installation and production capacities being concentrated so largely in China?
So in terms of installation, I will say it doesn't have a lot of consequence, simply because if the installation are concentrated in a country, that doesn't change much for the rest of the industry. Where it could become an issue if it's the concentration of production capacity within one country. And very simply put, because if there is like one issue happening in a country, then the whole supply chain for the rest of the world is going to be quite a mess. And that's something and it's not even an issue in the internal country, but also geopolitics and political opinion can also play in there. We're seeing this actually at the moment in Europe, especially with tariffs being implemented on electrical vehicles, for example. And if something similar happens to solar panels, then the dynamic of the market will change in Europe and in the rest of the country. So that's one risk, is that if you have only put all the eggs in the same basket, then you might have a risk of a big disruption for the supply chain in general.
All right, now let's cross our fingers that those disruptions won't happen anytime soon. Looking at another big market, the US. How will the solar market develop in the US? Because on the one hand, modules might cost 2 to 3 times as much due to tariffs. And on the other hand, you have remuneration models such as net metering being scaled back.
Yes, so the US will actually be a very interesting market to watch in the coming years, and it was already in 2023. The market in 2021, 2022 was a bit distorted, of course, via the trade tariff and the barriers that were implemented to importing modules from China to the US. So the market had quite a dip in 2022. But 2023 also marks the first year of the Inflation Reduction Act re-implementations. And the Inflation Reduction Act actually allows to have more subsidies for production and also for development of a project. So this means that in general, this has allowed the market to grow again to about 32, 33 gigawatts compared to 20 roughly in 2022. So the market is actually growing. Now what you were mentioning about the end of a specific subsidy, such as net metering, that is true. So for example, California used to be like the largest market and it was dominantly by rooftop market. And now the net metering scheme has changed and it's a bit less interesting. However, in general, the US market is mostly driven by utility scale project more than rooftop. So we're pretty confident that with the increase of manufacturing capacity in the US, and here we have to know, for example, that module production capacity almost doubled in 2023 alone, so just 1 year after the Inflation Reduction Act implementation. So the production capacity already increased, and that already has a result really on the industry that we're able to grow at the moment. So I will not say that the issue will be on tariffs and on the end of some specific schemes such as the net metering, because we are seeing that the market is already growing. Actually, the key thing that could maybe slow down the market is more on the permitting side and on the grid connection side more than on any subsidies being available.
And now that actually is interesting what you mentioned also with permitting and grid connections being the problem. Once again, the other episode that we had with Rana Deep, the executive director of Run 21, I think she mentioned that there was like 1,500, so 1,500 gigawatts of capacity waiting to be connected, with probably various reasons such as exactly permitting and grid connections being the issue. Now, before we dive a little bit deeper into price developments, just let's throw in some technology questions here. Are there any technologies you could single out that they have really contributed to this massive growth?
So yes, on the module point of view particularly, there's been an improvement of the technology. So we've been moving away from the PERC technology, moving to TOPCon technology. So those names might seem complicated, but they just designated two different technologies in the efficiency, in module to actually transform the sunlight into electricity. And TOPCon is more efficient than PERC. And at the moment, there is a shift in the technology going to TOPCon. And that has an impact that all the production line that we're actually doing PERC module are now shifting to TOPCon, and that could actually probably a bit slow down the deployment because we need to actually make the transformation of the existing factories.
Now, I've heard that in the years to come, there might be a 500% overcapacity or oversupply of modules. That's one thing. Then you have the price development. I think particularly the reduction of prices by 50%. How are all these things together affecting growth and the market?
So yes, there is an overcapacity of production now compared to the demand of solar module. I could not confirm whether it's 500, a bit less, a bit more, but yeah, there is definitely an overproduction. And what consequence it can have on the solar market is that at the moment, manufacturers are making very small margin on modules because it's becoming so cheap. And so there will be, in the coming months, coming year, a lot of consolidation between companies. And depending on how those consolidation turns out, it will be like less manufacturing capacity or even a bit more if they actually succeed to increase it. But I don't think it will have an immediate effect on the market, but maybe in the longer term, because module price will and the need to go up again. So if the module price go up again with the consolidation of companies, the product will be a bit more expensive and maybe a bit less affordable for developers. It will change a bit the return rate they can have on their project.
Okay, also there we might see some various movements in the market in the future. Now, you did not only do an analysis, but you also recommended some specific policy measures in your report. Which are the ones that are the most important?
If I had to single out one recommendation we have at the moment, is really to bring forward the flexibility and storage capacity for all markets. So what we mean by flexibility is really allowing the electricity that's generated at one point to be shifted to another point, because solar has a peak of generation in the middle of the day, but the consumption is at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. And this needs to be solved the soonest as possible, because it already has an issue on some countries. I'm thinking about Spain, which has experienced a lot of negative price actually because there were too much electricity produced at some time. And so for developers, that will be an issue because that will harm their revenue. And so the main recommendation we have at the moment, I think, is really increase flexibility, increase the installation of batteries with power plants, and you don't need long battery. Even 2 hours battery can actually already help the returns on your plants.
All right, we're really jumping very quickly from topic to topic here, but we're trying to make the best out of having the opportunity to talk to you. Now, let's talk about investments. The IEA, so the International Energy Agency, has reported that investment in solar energy has outpaced also all other generation technologies. Why is there such a big interest in really investing into solar?
I think the big interest there is that it's the easiest and fastest technology to deploy. For example, I was actually talking to a couple of developers here on the show, and some of them are working both on solar, wind, both onshore and offshore. And they were actually telling me, like, if they're working on solar, they have the possibility to install 100 gigawatt, 150 gigawatt. On offshore wind, they might have a 10 gigawatt market. So maybe like the cost of, the revenue of the wind farm might be a bit more, but it takes much more time to actually deploy a wind farm than a solar farm. And so I think that's being the easiest technology to deploy. I think that's why there's so many people actually investing in it and developing the capacity for it.
Now, one challenge, though, is that those investments are not really equally distributed over all the countries globally. Specifically, countries that are still in the process of catching up have a big issue attracting investments or realizing investments. What could be done to equalize investments more and to really make solar not only a big factor in reaching our climate goals, but also in reaching our social sustainable goals?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think no one has a real answer to that at this stage. But really, I think the concentration of the industry within one country is already a limiting factor to actually develop and to attract investment in other countries. Because you're not sure that you will be able to compete compared to a country that has already developed so much of capacity. So I think maybe try to already spread out the manufacturing capacity across different regions might also already help. And then I think of one region, just for example, like the African region and Middle East, there will be a lot of demand for electricity coming in the coming years. There's a lot of electrification to generate, and there's still very limited amount of investment in those countries, and there will be a need for that. So how do we achieve that? It's really just to streamline after the process and the framework to actually allow for investment in specific countries and making clarification on what are the conditions for investments, and also some tools from international organizations actually can bring forward some best practices across countries.
Actually, also on the first day here during the conference in the evening, I talked to a developer from Nigeria who said that apparently they're really crazy about getting their hands on solar. So there seems to be a huge interest in it. And if investments can also be directed in that direction, then this really should take off. So now last question here. One thing your outlook also forecasts is a market size of 870 gigawatt by 2028. So that would be in 3.5 years, almost a doubling. What challenges need to be overcome to reach this target?
Well, I think we've already touched upon a couple during the interview, but if I can summarize maybe the major one I see like ahead. First of all, it will be introducing more easily storage and flexibility solution to actually allow for capacity to come to the grid. And you also mentioned the number of about 1.5 terawatts, or so 1,500 gigawatts being queuing just to be able to get connected in the US. That will be a key component of having that growth. The second one is also streamlining the permitting to have access to the land, developing also all other technologies such as floating PV, agri-PV, agrivoltaics. So that will be key. And then the third one I would say is really actually making sure we have enough workforce to actually, because installing panels, it's actually very job intensive, especially on the rooftop segment. So we'll need to make sure that we have enough people working in industry and to attract people and workers and young people in the industry.
So lots of work to be done. In order to meet our climate goals, which is the overall goal we should not lose sight of, I think we need to get to 1,000 gigawatts of renewables being installed per year, if I caught that number correctly in the past days. Are we on track in regards to solar?
So reaching the 1.5 degree goal actually means a lot of different things depending on how we look at it. So reaching the 1,000 gigawatt per year is not specifically a target that we need to reach to be on track to the 1.5. But that's where the industry is actually leading. But if you look at different renewable studies, you will find very different results and very different numbers of how much solar do we need actually by 2030 and by 2050. And this is mostly done on a methodological point of view. So do we want like a net zero industry or a carbon free power sector? So there's a lot of different numbers out there. So I will be actually it will be impossible for me to say exactly how much wind solar we need exactly to reach 1.5 gigawatt, because it's also depend of how much electrification happens, how much the wind industry develops, how much the nuclear industry develops or not. So that will be a lot of change that will impact the need for solar. But for sure, we need to develop more than we need at the moment, because if we look at the total electricity generated around the globe, only 5% remains solar at the moment. So this needs to increase for sure.
Thanks a lot, Christophe. This was really a fast-paced ride through all of the various numbers and aspects the global market outlook by SolarPower Europe has covered. Thanks a lot for giving us this insight. Is there anything that you'd be really excited to talk about in 2025 if you were to be here again in Munich during the Smart RE? What would be the single thing that really would excite you the most as a development for the market?
I think the development of manufacturing capacities in Europe and across the globe will be a key element to really look at more solar deployment across the globe. So that will be, I think, a key topic for the coming years.
Thanks a lot for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Make sure to also check out all the other episodes of our special mini-series recorded live here in Munich during the SmartR E Europe conference and exhibition. And even better, join us for the SmartR E Europe in 2025. More information on thesmartre.de. Looking forward to meeting you.